Ford's Theater. The night of April 14th, 1865. At a performance of Our American Cousin, a popular comedy, John Wilkes Booth shot Abraham Lincoln. The president was carried across the street to the home of William Peterson, a tailor. His friends and family kept vigil with the doctors through the night, but it was clear he was dying. One of the most extraordinary men ever to be president of the United States had been fatally wounded by a fanatic. Lincoln was, in a way, the last victim of the Civil War that had torn the country apart for 4 years. A war that had ended only 5 days before. When he died at 7:22 on that gray morning, Edwin M. Stanton is said to have whispered, "Now he belongs to the ages." Abraham Lincoln was born in a log cabin near Hodgenville, Kentucky on February 12th, 1809. His father was Thomas Lincoln and his mother, Nancy Hanks. He grew up on lonely farms. He had to do what every frontier boy did. It was back-breaking work, clearing, planting, helping with the chores. Young Abe had learned to use an axe, but he also yearned to read and write, despite the fact that his father, a poor man, needed him on the farm.
My father taught me to work, but he never taught me to love it.
For the next 9 years, Lincoln lived on a small farm. Despite his demanding father, he read every book he could borrow in any moment he could find.
The things I want to know are in books.
He watched preachers and how they could hold a crowd. He imitated them, and he also began to pick up the rough, folksy humor that delighted his friends all his life. He grew to young manhood in the wilderness, curious and ambitious. In March of 1830, Thomas Lincoln moved his family again to the windy prairie near Decatur, Illinois. Abe helped his father clear the land, build the log cabin, plant the corn. But it was time for a change. So in the spring of 1831, he hired out to a man named Denton Offutt to build a flatboat and take it to New Orleans. But the boat wasn't very far down the Sangamon when it grounded near a small town called New Salem. Lincoln was impressed. Upon his return from New Orleans, he settled in New Salem to run the store Offutt was opening there. It was in New Salem that Lincoln really blossomed out. For the first time, he lived among people in a real community. New Salem was a thriving town of about 25 families who owned and read books and lent them. He got to know the people of New Salem and their children. Lincoln made his first real friends and found that people liked him. Here he had a celebrated match with a local wrestler, Jack Armstrong. It was called a draw, but it showed Lincoln to be strong, fearless, and fair. In New Salem, he learned to debate, improve his grammar and speech, and taught himself math. Ambition was beginning to burn in him. The attraction was politics. So, in March of 1832, at 23, he decided to run for the state assembly.
My politics are short and sweet, like an old woman's dance. If elected, I shall be thankful. If not, it'll be all the same.
In April, he rode off to the Black Hawk War as elected captain of the local volunteers. It wasn't much of a war, and Lincoln said about it,
I had a good many bloody struggles with mosquitoes. I bent a musket pretty bad on one occasion.
By late July, Lincoln was back in New Salem and took up his run for the Assembly again. He didn't win, but this setback spurred him to greater effort to improve himself. He decided if he was to succeed in politics, he had to learn the law. So he read the law. In the next 2 years, his training in the law helped him as a politician, and so did his faithful party service. In 1836, he was licensed to practice law and was re-elected to the State House. One of the policies he advocated was woman's suffrage. It was evidence of Lincoln's caring for people and his concern about the inequities that he saw around him. In 1839, he met Mary Todd. She was from a prominent slaveholding family in Lexington, Kentucky. A young woman, cultured and much admired. 2 years later, they were married. In May of 1844, they bought a home at 8th and Jackson in Springfield, the only home Lincoln was ever to own. He and Mary had 4 sons in the Springfield house. One died there. Lincoln rode the law circuit, tried cases, studied, and made long-lasting friendships in the next dozen years. In 1847, he took advantage of the growing strength of the Whig position and ran for the U.S. House of Representatives. He won a seat and spent 2 years in Washington. Again, he was a faithful congressman and party man. He made a small name for himself by opposing the then raging Mexican War, and his feelings grew more toward an anti-slavery position. Like many first-term congressmen, he felt he had little influence in Washington, so he returned to Illinois, depressed and bitter. He chose not to run again, but instead began to build his Springfield law practice. He was an astute lawyer. He was asked to defend young Duff Armstrong, son of the Jack Armstrong he had wrestled many years before in New Salem, against a charge of murder. Lincoln agreed to take the case without a fee. The chief witness for the prosecution stated that he had seen Duff commit the murder at night by the light of a bright moon. Lincoln then pulled out an almanac. On the night in question, the moon was in its first quarter and gave virtually no light. The witness was clearly lying, and Duff was acquitted. Lincoln was a smart lawyer. In Springfield, Lincoln listened, made speeches, and waited. He was a success as a lawyer, but he felt his political ambitions were thwarted. Then, at the Illinois State Republican Convention of 1858, held in Springfield, he was chosen the party's candidate for the U.S. Senate. And in response, on June 16th, Lincoln delivered a remarkable speech. His feelings on slavery had matured, and he was no longer hesitant about speaking out.
A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. It will become all one thing or all the other.
The House divided speech focused attention in Illinois and across the nation on Lincoln and his views on slavery. More than any other factor, it brought on the most famous public dispute in American history: the 7 debates between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen A. Douglas. Lincoln opposing the spread of slavery in the name of reason and justice, and Douglas defending it with passion and a sense of popular will. At the last debate in Alton on October 15th, referring to slavery, Lincoln said,
"It is the eternal struggle between 2 principles, right and wrong. They are the 2 principles that have stood face to face from the beginning of time."
On Election Day, November 2nd, 1858, the people of Illinois sent Douglas back to the Senate. Even so, Lincoln gained something too. The debates made him a figure of national interest. He was now aware that he was politically on the way up. He campaigned against the spread of slavery all through 1859. Then he was invited to New York to speak at Cooper Union on February 27, 1860. It was a speech opposing the spread of slavery, cued to the convictions of his audience. Lincoln said,
"Let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith, to the end, dare to do our duty as we understand it."
The speech made Lincoln a potential presidential candidate. He surrounded himself with wise and clever counselors like Richard Oglesby. Just before the Illinois State Republican Convention in May 1860, Oglesby learned that Lincoln had been a rail splitter. So he had Lincoln supporters parade on the convention floor logs Lincoln had split 30 years before, and a banner proclaiming, "Lincoln the Rail Splitter." Thus, a popular symbol was born, Lincoln, the humble rail splitter. The 1860 Republican National Convention was held in Chicago. William Seward was the favorite candidate, with Lincoln a serious dark horse. Most people thought Seward would get the nomination. But in David Davis, Lincoln had a shrewd floor manager. With Lincoln's consent, Davis played one tune. Seward can't win, Lincoln can. He asked Lincoln for possible compromises to win the nomination, but Lincoln, who remained in Springfield, telegraphed,
"Make no contracts that will bind me."
May 18th, 1860. The balloting started at 10 in the morning. On the third ballot, Abraham Lincoln became the Republican candidate for president. Little Grace Bedell of Westfield, New York, wrote to suggest that Lincoln grow a beard because
all the ladies like whiskers and would tease their husbands to vote for you.
Lincoln answered,
"Having never worn any, do you not think people would call it a piece of silly affectation if I were to begin it now?"
But the idea stayed with him. Lincoln faced two Democratic rivals, Stephen A. Douglas for Northern moderates and John Breckinridge for the hardline Southerners. It was not a pleasant campaign. Lincoln was viciously represented as a radical and warmonger out to destroy the South. He was neither. On November 6th, he was elected President of the United States. The South threatened secession. The day after his election, Lincoln told some reporters,
"Well, boys, your troubles are over now. Mine have just begun."
Lincoln left for Washington from the Springfield Depot on February 11th, 1861, never to return again alive. On the way, the train stopped in upstate New York, and Lincoln was able to show Grace Bedell his new-grown whiskers. On March 4th, 1861, he became the 16th President of the United States. 7 states had already seceded. In his inaugural address, he said,
"In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it."
The country was seething. Civil war was on every tongue. The first question was, should the garrison at Fort Sumter in the Charleston Harbor be reinforced or removed? On April 12th, Confederate batteries opened fire on the fort and answered the question. The Civil War had begun. On April 15th, Lincoln's proclamation for 75,000 militiamen was his response. The Union would be defended and preserved. 11 states had dissolved their ties with the government and formed the Confederate States of America. They had to be brought back into the Union. Over the next 4 years, the country was torn by war, the ugliest sort. Brother against brother. It was a struggle of ideas that rent the country. Before it was over, more than 600,000 would die in the conflict. By 1862, Lincoln concluded the nation could never be brought together again as long as it remained half slave and half free. So, on January 1st, 1863, he issued a proclamation that
all persons held as slaves within any state the people whereof shall be in rebellion against the United States shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free.
the war grew ever more violent. On November 19th, 1863, at the Gettysburg battlefield, Lincoln spoke words of solace and dedication that have become part of the tradition of our language.
We here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
The war was, as Carl Sandburg said, fought over a verb. Before it, you could say the United States are. After it, Lincoln had made it, the United States is. But the war was more than that. For the first time in our history, brother fought brother to rid us of slavery and finally make brothers of us all. The weight of all this was heavy on Lincoln's soul, and it showed more and more in his face. But his humor stayed ready and easy. Once, when people criticized him for telling jokes, he said,
"Were it not for this vent, I would die. I must laugh to keep from crying."
In the presidential campaign of 1864, Lincoln ran against George McClellan, once commander of the Army of the Potomac. It was, again, a bitter personal campaign that depressed him greatly. But Lincoln won handsomely. The United States supported his policy. It lifted his spirits a bit. In his second inaugural address, Lincoln reminded his fellow citizens,
"With malice toward none, with charity toward all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds."
The war had started badly for the Union, then seesawed, and finally generals like Sherman, Sheridan, and Grant turned the tide. At last, on April 9th, 1865, at the Wilmer McLean House in Appomattox, Virginia, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant. The grimmest war in America's history was virtually over. At the celebration in Washington, Lincoln asked the band to play Dixie. It was time to bind up the nation's wounds. But unbound elements remained. Less than a week later, Lincoln was dead. Lincoln holds a unique place in history. He is one of the very few political leaders admired and respected everywhere. Why? perhaps because of his unswerving faith in what he called
the whole great family of man.
as exemplified in the whole of a united America. He saw his life's work as a struggle to prove that men could govern themselves with justice for all the governed, for the good of their children and
Their children, and their children's children, and the countless myriads who should inhabit the earth in other ages.
Lincoln was a man who spoke with courage and compassion for all people, who in all times and places have no voice of their own.